BlogTalk Radio.
Welcome to the AME Food Testing Show. Today's topic is the Food Safety Modernization Act and new food safety testing rules. Our guest is Michele Simon. She's a public health lawyer who has been researching and writing about the food industry and food politics since 1996. She specializes in legal strategies to counter corporate tactics that harm the public's health. For 4.5 years, she served as research and policy director for the Marin Institute, now the Alcohol Justice Institute, an alcohol industry watchdog group. Her groundbreaking 2007 report on alcoholic energy drinks led to a federal ban on these dangerous products. Michele has taught health policy at the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and lectures frequently on corporate tactics and policy solutions. She has written extensively on the politics of food, and her first book, Appetite for Profit: How the Food Industry Undermines Our Health and How to Fight Back, was published by Nation Books in 2006. She is also president of Eat Drinks Politics, an industry watchdog consulting firm. Ms. Simon has a master's degree in public health from Yale University, and she also received her law degree from the University of California, Hastings College of Law. She has also contributed to an article at ktvu.com just recently on food safety. I'd now like to welcome Michele Simon. Michele?
Yes, hi there.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Michele, would you like to add anything to your illustrious biography that I just read?
No, I think you pretty much covered it, although I also am actually a consultant with the Center for Food Safety, and I wanted to get that in, too.
Very good. Well, today's topic is the Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, and new food safety testing rules. Perhaps we can talk about what is the Food Safety Modernization Act?
Sure. Well, it was law that was passed a year and a half ago to try and basically update the way FDA regulates food safety. So, we haven't had any significant updates to FDA's jurisdiction over food safety in decades. And, while the other agency that regulates food safety, USDA, has a lot of authority and much more funding than FDA. FDA sort of is the poor stepchild when it comes to food safety, even though that agency actually oversees much more of the food supply than USDA. And so this was an attempt to sort of shore up FDA's authority, give it some more oversight over the food supply in various ways. And so this was a pretty monumental law that was passed, and it was unusual in that it actually had bipartisan support, and even certain sectors of the food industry recognized the importance of updating FDA's authority. And so it was a large effort undertaken by various sectors, and it got done. And so that's the basic premise of it, to bring FDA authority and food safety inspection rules into 21st century.
Very good. What are the goals of this legislation?
Well, the goals are really to have different aspects depending on which section we're talking about. So, for example, FDA previously didn't have mandatory recall authority. So that means, in the event of an outbreak, it would sort of be up to the kindness of the company to decide whether they wanted to institute a recall. And of course, this is vitally important for making sure that any contaminated food in the food supply comes off of store shelves and hopefully doesn't make its way into the family's kitchens. And so now with this new law, FDA won't have to rely on the kindness of companies to voluntarily recall contaminated products. FDA would actually be able to require companies to do so in the event of an outbreak. And so that's one huge example and improvement in FDA's authority. In addition, there are a number of specific inspection controls that are increased, and so one of the biggest concerns has been on imports, and so increasingly more of our food supply is imported, and so now FDA will have additional authority to do inspections. Foreign suppliers will have to register with FDA, because before the FDA couldn't even get a handle on exactly who the various players are who are importing foods into this country. So they will have to register with FDA and also verify that they are adhering to U.S. safety inspection standards. So these are just some of the ways that the law is, designed to get to preventing outbreaks from happening. Really, not just relying on outbreaks after they happen and then trying to trace it back, which of course is often too late to stop the illnesses that result from an outbreak, but to really try and prevent outbreaks from happening in the first place by giving FDA more authority, by giving them these additional safeguards in registering and adhering to certain safety protocols and so forth to make sure we can stop outbreaks even before they begin.
Well, that's an excellent summary of some of the challenges that we're facing. But how does this new law actually protect consumers?
Well, as many people are aware, we've had a really unfortunate series of outbreaks, particularly in the last few years. So, for example, we've seen the bacteria Listeria show up in cantaloupe, and over 30 people died last year when we had this outbreak happen, and something as simple as eating a piece of melon. And so the idea is to try and prevent these outbreaks from occurring by having these additional safety mechanisms in place. And so that's one example of just really trying to put prevention at the core of the way we do things. Now, it doesn't. The thing that I think is important to understand, while there are some additional controls and, safeguards, doesn't mean there's any guarantee. And so, we also have to be thinking about how this sort of contamination happens in the first place. And that's, what we try to kind of educate people about with the Center for Food Safety is our industrialized food supply. So like that outbreak in cantaloupe, for example, happened at one plant, but then the melons got shipped all over the country, right? And so, really have to be rethinking, I think, some of the ways that we even produce, grow, and distribute food, because this law will be good as far as it goes, again, to give FDA more authority to help protect consumers, but we really also have to be thinking in this bigger picture way about, perhaps not shipping food all over the country if it can be avoided. I mean, we don't have to be eating melons, every month of the year and so forth. So, it'll do what the law can do, what it can to help put some safety measures into place, but there's always these bigger picture concerns that will remain.
Well, Michele, I'll sensitize you to our audience today, which is primarily composed of food producing managers, food quality managers, food safety managers, and food security managers. These are the folks that are charged daily with getting the food out the door of their facilities, whether they're growing it, whether they're processing it in some way, or they're enhancing it or preserving it and then packaging and shipping it off to market. What advice do you have for this particular population of our listenership?
Well, I think anyone who's involved in food production should be demanding that FDA finalize the regulations that we're all waiting for. So, they said a year and a half has passed since the law went into effect, and we were supposed to have seen regulations by now, and all news accounts say that the regulations are being held up in the White House, and particularly with the Office of Management and Budget, where most regulations go to never see the light of day. And, what's concerning is that no one can quite figure out why these regulations are being stalled, and it should be particularly concerning for those who produce and distribute food, because it's creating a lot of uncertainty within the food industry. And, there's questions swirling around whether certain provisions of the Act will be enforced while we're still waiting for the rules to even come out, the proposed rules to come out from FDA, let alone be finalized. And, even reading about some dispute where food industry says, clearly the provisions won't be enforced if we don't even have the regulations. And, it's no one in the food industry likes uncertainty, right? Because that means there aren't clear guidelines on how to comply with the law. So if I was, thinking about how to run my business, I would be demanding that the FDA put more pressure on the White House, that we put pressure on the White House together to get these rules out the door and not let this languish, because not only is everyone at risk the further we delay enforcement of these rules, but again, those who are responsible for complying with the law remain in this sort of limbo and uncertain place, which is not good for anybody.
Well, Michele, thank you for outlining some of the stalling motivations. What do you think? What's your rationale? Why they're stalling it?
Well,
OMB?
Normally my go-to excuse is sort of the food industry lobby, which is notorious for stalling all kinds of regulations in other arenas. And yet, in this case, it's really a mystery, because they said before, when it came to getting the bill passed, we actually did have a multi-stakeholder effort engaged, and even with getting these rules out the door, the food industry signed on to a letter with consumer groups saying, we want these rules finalized. We never know. There could be certain sectors of industry behind the scenes that want to see things stalled. But, the point is, it's really not to anyone's benefit to keep this delay happening. Now, it is true that there are various sets of rules, at least 4 different sets of rules that we're waiting on. And so there's no question that it's complex, and that's what Michael Taylor with the FDA has been saying all along. Well, this is, we're going to be delayed here because it's so complex, but, enough of that. Really, it's time to get these rules out the door, because once they are released, that's not the end of the game, right? That's just proposed rules, and then we have to go through comment period, and that whole thing could take another year or two to get them finalized. So there are certain provisions that have gone into effect and can go into effect in the meantime, but again, there's still a lot of uncertainty about certain provisions. So it's really unclear exactly what's holding it up. But in the meantime, we're seeing more outbreaks, which is putting everyone at risk. So, for example, there was a salmonella outbreak in tuna scrape, which, no one ever heard of before this salmonella outbreak, which was imported from India. So, again, imports are a huge problem. And so that's, one arena where we especially need additional controls. And every day that we delay is another, potential outbreak waiting to happen.
Excellent points, Michele. What about funding for the implementation of FSMA? What's the status on that?
Well, it's not really good news. So, of course, according to Congress, we're in sort of this budget crisis mode, and the most recent proposed budget for FDA going forward does not provide sufficient funding to fully implement all of the aspects of this new law. And so, the question remains, how will FDA be able to carry out its stepped-up inspections, particularly in other parts of the world where they need to have, more inspectors and at our borders and so forth? How will FDA be able to carry out the provisions of this law without additional funding? And so one of the ideas that has been proposed, as opposed to increased taxes, which nobody likes to hear about, but another potential funding mechanism is to have user fees. In other words, have the food suppliers actually pay fees to FDA for these inspections to be carried out. And this isn't such a crazy idea. the pharmaceutical industry pays fees to FDA for its approval process. And so, but as you might imagine, this is causing a fair amount of controversy. The food industry is, even though they say they're in favor of the law, they're not so keen on having to pay for the implementation of the law. And this is an issue that needs to be properly debated and discussed. And I don't think it's so crazy to say, why shouldn't the food industry have to pony up some dollars to help pay for increased inspections? And and without it, it's not really clear where the money is going to come from, given Congress's cutting the axes or the knives are out for cutting the budget. So it's definitely a big question and a huge potential problem to have a new law that won't have adequate funding to be fully implemented.
Well, Michele, I'm going to ask you to frame your response to this next question. Again, in light of our audience, these are the folks that actually are responsible for producing the food at a profit and yet safe and of a high quality. Are user fees the way to fund FSMA?
Well, I guess I'll ask you, what would be the reason we shouldn't have user fees fund this law, right? I mean, if a food maker, manufacturer, what have you, wants to do business, right, they have to comply with certain regulations, right? It's a cost of doing business. And so the funding has to come from somewhere. So it seems, and this is typical in other areas of law. I mean, I think whenever an industry wants to fight back, they sort of want to isolate themselves and make it seem like this is such a crazy idea, when actually it's not. This is something that is done in many other areas of law. I've also worked in alcohol policy, and alcohol companies pay licensing fees to state regulators to help enforce alcohol regulations. So, it's a very typical way of doing business to have industries that want to engage in stream of commerce and yet are engaged in a certain risky business with which, unfortunately, the potential for contamination, food is potentially a risky business. Then, if you think about it as if not paying FDA, they should, these food companies have to do their own inspections, and they should be willing to pay FDA to help them carry out those inspections. So, really, it should be, this is all should be looked at as collaboration, right? How can we all work together to keep the food supply safe? And, you can't do that with no money. So it just seems logical to me to have those who want to make money from the sale of their product have to incorporate. And if it means raising prices on food, then so be it. That's the cost, the true cost of food. And I think, another argument around this is that Americans are used to paying such cheap prices for food. And there are a number of reasons that food is, relatively cheap in this country. But we pay in other ways, right? So we may pay $1 for a cheeseburger today, but then we pay $2 for the health care costs tomorrow, or we pay for the, treatment of the salmonella outbreak tomorrow. And so, it's really about paying now to prevent problems from happening later that someone's going to pay for down the line.
Well, that's an excellent point. I'd like to bifurcate the discussion into two groups. The very large food production companies that already have existing food safety programs and are very aggressive. In fact, they're probably the sponsors of the bill in many ways. And the very small, which I'm going to proffer to you are the majority of food producers that have very limited resources to apply toward food safety inspections. They'll do them if they have to, but they minimize those efforts. Food testing, which is an area of specialty that I particularly know about, and their margins are particularly low. Will this user fee implementation act as a consolidation, allowing the larger companies to either force out of business or force it to sell the smaller organizations that cannot adapt?
Okay, well, let's take a step back and say and acknowledge that this concern about how the overall Food Safety Modernization Act would potentially impact smaller producers was handled during the debate over the law, and so it was acknowledged that new regulations, of course, tend to impact smaller producers more than larger ones, and so there was something called the Tester Amendment passed, which was an aim to, exempt smaller producers from some of the regulations of this law. So similarly, to go specifically to your question, we don't have any proposal on the table that I've seen about how user fees would be implemented. But of course, it would be logical and not that crazy to either have a sliding scale for smaller producers or even exempt the smallest producers from the user fees. However, I will say that I don't think anyone, no matter how they do business, should be exempt from food safety, oversight, right? Because we've seen outbreaks in organic farms and small farms and, all kinds of production. And it is true that many of the outbreaks, the serious outbreaks, tend to happen in larger producers because, for a number of reasons, but mostly because they're the ones that, distribute all over the country. But the point is, any outbreak can happen anywhere. And so, but that doesn't mean that there can't be ways we can look at to minimize the impact on smaller producers. So, of course, that can be done.
It's a very astute response. Well, Michele, I'd like to conclude that portion of the show and just ask if you could brief us on your current and future projects.
Sure. Well, one of the areas I am interested in is continuing to look at how to improve food safety across the board. So, for example, while, this law addressed FDA food safety mechanisms, we still have a long way to go with the USDA. And, USDA oversees meat and poultry inspection, and, there's a rule on the table, in fact, regarding pulling back on poultry inspection that USDA has proposed. They're proposing to put some of that inspection back into the hands of the private players, in other words, self-regulation, and a lot of groups have been opposing that vehemently, and the Center for Food Safety is one of them. And so that's something that we're hoping the USDA will rethink, and, we need to have stronger inspections, not weaker inspections. Another area that we think there needs to be stepped up regulations on is requiring having more forms of bacteria being declared adulterants. So we just had a victory in that additional forms of E. coli have been declared adulterants. And this is important because it means it's illegal to put any contaminated product into the stream of commerce. So what we need to add to that list, though, is salmonella. So we've seen terrible outbreaks of salmonella in ground meat and poultry over the years, and we're not able to get at that issue, and in poultry in general. It's a huge problem. And we haven't been able to reduce salmonella and outbreaks the way we have with E. coli, mainly because of this not being declared an adulterant. And so, it really makes no sense to have E. coli declared an adulterant and not salmonella when, what we see as a result of making it illegal to put contaminated products into the stream of commerce is that companies, actually step up their inspections. And so we've seen reductions in E. coli outbreaks, but not in salmonella. So that's another area that we'd like to see the USDA take action on.
Well, Michele, that's an excellent area. I would like to make one clarification. It's not necessarily an inspection for the organism. It is a screening or a surveillance for the presence of the organism as an adulterant, which is an area of specialty that, again, that's my area. I assist food producers in engaging in a surveillance program. A lot of food producers will emphasize their general or good manufacturing practices, hand gloves, hand washing, worker aprons, and and hats and things like that, and keeping the area clean. And then they also have a sanitation program or an environmental cleaning program. What a lot of companies and food producers generally are weak on is the surveillance of their product prior to shipment, which is, I think, encapsulated in the Food Safety Modernization Act, is it not?
I'm not familiar with that particular aspect of it. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, what other projects do you have on your agenda?
Well, I also work on various areas related to nutrition policy. So food safety is one of my areas of expertise, but I've also, for many years, written about nutrition policy. And so actually with the Center for Food Safety, I will be drafting comments for the New York City proposal to limit the size of sugary soft drinks, which is causing a lot of controversy in New York and around the country. And actually, we'll be going to New York for the July 24th hearing that they're having to give comments on that to support New York City's effort to limit the size of soft drinks in an era where we're seeing all kinds of chronic diseases due to poor diet and overconsumption of sugary beverages. So that's another arena. And then related to that, I also...
Hold on, Michelle. I'd like
sure.
to make one clarification there as well. It's primarily, it's a chemist, it's high fructose corn syrup that's implemented in most foods. Having eaten at McDonald's last night, I'll tell you a lot of that food, it's brown coloring from a brown sugar, and the drinks that you're referring to have high fructose corn syrup, which there's an ancillary issue whether or not that corn that produced that syrup was genetically modified and the apparent genetic effects of that on the consumer.
Yeah, well, high fructose corn syrup is right, is one concern, but all sweeteners are caloric. So as far as, just having too many calories in the diet, sugar is just as bad for you as high fructose corn syrup. There are some theories that say high fructose corn syrup is worse, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But focusing so much on high fructose corn syrup is resulting in the absurdity of products being marketed as containing sugar and not high fructose corn syrup, which is just silly because sugar is an extremely processed product as well. So there's more to it than just a particular chemical involved in the sugary substance. But
agreed. As you look at high school children and children in school nowadays, it's a striking contrast. The children is a severe challenge of obesity.
Right.
In the country.
Yeah, and really am concerned more broadly about chronic diseases, and doesn't so much matter if you're overweight or not. And there's actually a study just came out showing that even diet soft drinks can have deleterious effects that we haven't really considered, because the artificial sweeteners are tricking the body into producing insulin, and yet then the calories don't come, and so the insulin has to go somewhere and it turns to fat. I mean, there's all kinds of we're really engaged in a massive chemical experiment with many of the additives in our food supply. So
fascinating projects. Any others?
Yeah, well, I'm also very concerned about and trying to draw more attention to the problem of marketing to children. And so, food companies are engaged in a lot of predatory marketing to young children that don't even understand that they're being marketed to, and just trying to, bring more attention to that problem and get companies to stop. For example, get McDonald's stop to marketing Happy Meals to small children and so forth. And I'm also working with a couple of law firms on potential lawsuits in that regard as well.
Very good. Well, Michele, you have been an excellent interviewee today. I hope you enjoyed your time today, and look forward, as your other projects mature, to thinking about being a guest on the show again.
That sounds great. Thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you, Michele. Hope you have a great day.